Welcome back to Business Week here on Arise News. The current global disruption to gas supplies is reshaping the balance of power in Europe. There is also potential for increased demand for natural gas resources from Africa after the European Commission last year announced a plan to make Europe independent of Russian fossil fuels before 2030, following the invasion of Ukraine in the year before. In 2019, Europe imported about 12 billion cubic meters of LNG from Nigeria. Growing gas demand could potentially be met through investment in gas export infrastructure such as LNG export terminals or continental gas pipelines to deliver African gas to Europe and other global customers. But beyond exports, experts estimate that harnessing Nigeria's proven gas reserves can stimulate an estimated gross value added of $18.3 billion annually to the domestic economy and even support 6.5 million full-time equivalent jobs. Well, who better to explore the opportunities and challenges facing our gas domestic industry than Audrey Joe-Ezigbo, the Deputy Managing Director and co-founder of Falcon Corporation Limited, one of Nigeria's foremost midstream and downstream gas distribution and trading firms. They've been in the business since 1994. Audrey Joe-Ezigbo was also the first female president of the Nigeria Gas Association in its 22-year history. Welcome to the show, Ms. Joe-Ezigbo. Great to have you.
Great to be here, Olaka.
So we've seen quite a lot happen globally in global gas markets, and many people feel like perhaps we missed an opportunity. But we're also seeing disruptions to global value chain. Based on your experience at Falcon Corporation, what has that been like? How have you had to adjust or adapt to the current climate around gas?
Right, thank you for that question. So as you know, COVID pulled a fast one on everyone. A lot of us had to rethink our business models, our supply chains. A lot of us who were already in that drive for diversification actually did better out of COVID. But of course, immediately after that, we're having to grapple with the impacts of the war. I always say that the war arrived right at my doorsteps. For instance, when one of my customers, had to shut down because their business was centered around the processing of wheat and their supplies were coming directly from Ukraine.
Okay.
So we did have to manage that. Now, one of the things that we saw was that, like I said, rethinking the business models, looking at other opportunities within the value chain, outside of the value chain to create revenues for your shareholder, looking at sustainability more critically. As you know, we don't operate in a bubble. Obviously, whatever is happening in the global markets is affecting us directly. So one of the things that COVID and the current happenings have shown us is that we have to deepen domestic consumption, that there has to be more of an in-country focus to deepen, gas infrastructure, looking both at the demand and supply sides. And I think that a lot of the work that has been happening with government finally found its bearing coming out of all that has been happening. So we were forced essentially
to focus domestically.
Exactly.
And many investors would argue, well, what are the revenue prospects from supplying to the domestic gas market? But you and two other companies, I think it was last year, signed a gas development agreement to supply gas, I believe, to the Lagos Free Zone. So clearly, yourself and the other companies, FHN and ND Western, clearly see opportunity and viability in the domestic gas market. What difference is that project going to make?
But I tell you what, when we think about domestic gas, first and foremost, it's long-term thinking.
Okay.
So we have to be able to look past the current constraints within the environment and think, where does the market need to go? What are we going to use to, shift the needle where Nigeria economic development is concerned? And obviously, natural gas is critical. For this project, what has happened is that we have come with our various competencies from upstream, midstream, downstream to enable a project that creates jobs, it creates infrastructure development and export potentials. So for now, the country, we're bleeding when it comes to our foreign revenues, earning potential capacity. So we must be looking at things that enable, earning dollars from different places. And this is one of the things that this project does because it's within a free zone. We have the seaport that is nearby.
So you can actually export gas well from the zone.
And not just that, but being able to attract the kinds of heavy industries into the zone that then creates that enhanced export profile for the country.
And I see that it's a $25 million gas agreement. So how much is that mostly the project sponsors putting their own money in or raising money from on commercial
Well, it's a
banks?
combination of both, actually. I mean, you can't, in my view, you must have skin in the game to be able to attract the kind of funding you need to get these kinds of projects off the ground. Yeah.
Okay, so, we often get questions, we're part of a women's energy network, and people often ask what new opportunities really exist in the gas value chain. People talk about LPG downstream, there's LNG, CNG, but some of those ones seem like really heavy lifting in terms of huge capex requirements. What are some of the new opportunities you're seeing within the value chain?
So, Rolak, I don't think it's about new opportunities. I think it's about us recognizing that we must then go and push those existing opportunities. When you look at what has been happening in the industry in the last 10, 15 years, even from a governmental perspective, that renewed focus to deepen, the value chain and bring more investors on board. As you know, coming out of the Petroleum Industry Act now, we have that dedicated midstream focus for gas. And that's one of the places where we have the greatest infrastructure gaps. So when you look at the value chain, we look at upstream, midstream, downstream. From the upstream point of view, one of the key things there is that over time, we have focused more, as you know, on associated gas because of that oil-centric mindset that we had before. But we have over 600 TCF of non-associated gas reserves that we need to prospect for. And there is need for, from a resilience point of view, for exploration dedicated in that regard. When we come to the midstream, what we lack the transportation infrastructure, storage is a challenge, processing facilities, treatment. So all those create opportunities. And of course, when we come downstream, now many things are shifting downstream because we're no longer just looking at gas to export. We're looking at gas to power. And now power has taken a dynamic that allows more people to come in. We're looking at gas to industry. And so we then have technologies, virtual technologies, whether it's CNG, mini LPG, mini LNGs, things that allow, for different levels of play by different investors. I also feel that at this point in time, when we talk about opportunities, we have to be very careful not to always dimension it from the supply side.
Okay.
That we have to be asking ourselves, how do we also remove this constraint whereby 80% thereabouts of the domestic production of gas, the consumption rather, is going to the power sector. So we need to have people coming up to invest in gas-based industries. And yes, you said, it looks like a lot of investment, and it is. Gas projects are typically very capital intensive. For a nation such as ours, the scale of what is required means that we can't have too many small, discrete projects. We actually this is a good time for collaborations. This is a good time for co-location so that economies of scales are playing out across board. So this is really not a gender conversation, it's an industry conversation to say that parties need to be able to come together, look for the opportunities, bring your own areas of strength. It may be financial, it may be technical, it may be commercial, and we create those kinds of consortium frameworks that then allow us to tackle those opportunities in chunks.
I mean, it's interesting because I guess your sort of three-way collaboration is an example of the type of skill we need. But you've mentioned all these LNG, LPG, CNG. And the question in my mind, honestly, for an industry that supplies, 80% of supplies goes to power, you said. Does Nigeria truly have a bankable value chain?
Okay.
At least by world-class standards. Because, every time the power sector comes into the discussion, I somewhat shudder because I think that sector by itself has challenges. So offtake is always challenged. Do we really have a bankable value chain?
Well, I like to be very brutal, so I'm going to just say it as I see it. This is one of those questions where you would have loved for your answer to be an unequivocal yes.
Okay.
Unfortunately, that's not what it is. But it's also not a no. And this is the reality. Like I said, it's a long-term play. Whether we're looking at this from an Africa-wide perspective or from a Nigeria perspective, and we're thinking, what are the levers? What's going to change? Really, right now, we have a huge energy deficit. Over 50% of our population are either unserved or underserved. And for us to be able to express the entrepreneurial capacity that we carry, the need for industrialization, we have to back it with gas. That's my view, and it's a tested and established view. What that means is that we can't keep looking at what is not working. We should be looking at what can we make to work. I think that the PIA, first of all, creates this framework within which we can say, okay, something is shifted fundamentally. Now, granted, one or two things have happened that may also cause us to pause and say, are we actually going to deploy this as it is, legislated? And that may be a concern for any investor. But I think that there is sufficient signaling from a long-term perspective to say
within the PIA.
Oh, yes, I think so.
Okay, so maybe I can press you further on that. What specific items of the PI, or generally, do you think is really the game changer for your sector?
Okay, for my sector, I tell you what, first and foremost, we are seeing more, better articulated regulations that are coming out. Regulations that came after extensive stakeholder engagement, and we see a lot of the industry views being brought on board. That's one. Within the PIA, we are seeing issues around the tax holidays. In fact, specifically for my sector, even an additional 5 years for those of us that want to invest in pipe infrastructure. We're seeing clarity around the pricing, the sectoral pricing framework. Some of the distortions that happened before are being taken away. So generally speaking, I feel that the landscape of investment is looking clearer. It doesn't take away some of the legacy challenges we've had, and this is really where the nation needs to rethink the direction going forward. That we have legacy issues that need to be resolved, and unfortunately also in the operationalization of the PIA and not doing the things that are, in that manner that are provided for, we may be creating new ones. So is that articulation and deliberate will, right, to deploy as planned that gives us that, clear investment overview and allows us to move forward. Those of us who are diehard believers in Nigeria, believe me, it's really difficult operating in this climate, but I maintain you have to wear the long view. The opportunities are there. We have the population, even though I do argue that you must strategically mine the value in your population for it to actually be a positive and not a problem for you. But at the same time, we have enough gaps that create opportunities. As an entrepreneur, you are not looking for a cozy environment that is like plug and play. You're looking for where the problems are, and then you dig deep to try and find the solutions, right? It's difficult because we're now dealing with a gamut of issues that are even beyond industry-specific issues. So at the macro level, even security and the like, but we're not going anywhere. Someone has to build this country, right? And we are seeing also that the lenders are thinking more robustly around it. I was reading a World Bank article that talked about the fact that, when you're thinking about projects, you're looking at financial, looking at commercial, looking at the risk profiles, that the problem in most of the developing countries is that they don't see an established enough institutional, legal and regulatory framework that then prevents the government from just, taking some arbitrary moves that can change the economics of any project. And that's what we see, a lot in Africa.
Yeah.
But I repeat that I really believe from what I'm seeing that the change is happening. It may not be at the pace we expect or we would like to see, but it is happening. And so the most savvy of investors have to stay plugged in.
You mentioned, I don't want to labor the point, but you mentioned legacy issues. And I'm wondering which in your, Falconet Corporation has been around for almost 30 years,
That's
I
right.
believe. So you've kind of seen it all. You've been through different oil and gas regulatory regimes.
Yeah.
I mean, what are some of the issues that really just impact the viability of a gas distribution infrastructure business?
Okay, I tell you one really key one is finance.
Okay.
And finance from various perspectives. So one is that, as you know, gas projects, beyond being capital intensive, they don't have the same kind of profit profiles that oil projects have. And so your repayment periods are longer and more extensive and so on. And then you really need to most times back it with a dedicated market. So your demand is now an issue in terms of credible demand and all that. But finance from the perspective of cost, one, and the capacity of the local banks to finance long-term at reasonable rates. We have a lot of, development and intervention type funds that are available. The ability to access them is now another conversation entirely.
Yes.
At the same time, we do not manufacture any of the components based on which, or majority of the components.
So you're literally having to import.
That's it.
Pretty
Now,
much the entire.
what is the challenge with that? It's foreign exchange. Why is that a challenge? Because we are contracting our components. For some people who even have technical expertise that they require to import, which happens sometimes. So you are contracting at, parallel rates most of the time. And yet your revenues are being benchmarked at the CBN rate. And what that means is that you have a mismatch between currency and revenues, and that's value erosion from the start. Right? So that is one key thing that continues to happen till now. When you're trying to raise Forex, you need to raise $5 million for a project. You are lucky if a bidding round comes back and they give you 25,000. So we see that what has happened, if I'll be blunt, is that there's a rent layer that has been created between funds that are meant to spur development in the gas sector and those who need those funds to actualize their projects. And so that's something we also need to deal with. I think that is one fundamental area because, like I said, we're seeing refining work going on the regulatory side, even the streamlining of the agencies, NUPRC, NMDPRA. So we're seeing that kind of coming together. One other thing that needs to happen, because we don't exist in a bubble, is that the multiplicity of agencies around about which you need to get permits for any one single gas project needs to be addressed. I mean,
there needs to be a consolidation.
Honestly,
and
it's
less
a one-stop shop approach we should be looking at. If I want to build a tank farm to debottleneck LPG storage within Port Harcourt, which is what our company is doing, I shouldn't have to deal with 30 different agencies putting chicken and egg type situations before me, creating such licensing fees that already just from the top, before I've even started the project, are eroding value. The problem with that also is because of the bureaucracies around that, the time that is lost, sometimes is impacting on your ability to close out with your lenders. And lenders, their capital is not always as patient.
And they can be very unforgiving.
I'm telling you, because there are other climes that are more welcoming. So we literally sometimes end up shooting ourselves in the foot. And really, that's not a sustainable way to go.
Indeed. I mean, there's so much to unpack there, but I wanted to look at two sides of funding. First of all, I think a couple of years ago, the Nigeria Content Development Monitoring Board introduced a fund specifically around gas, focusing particularly on the downstream parts of the value chain, areas like LPG, cylinder manufacturing. What is really the scale of the opportunity downstream? Because we often hear that LPG uptake in Nigeria is not as robust as other countries, but we know there is a need. We can't keep burning wood fuel or using dirtier forms of energy. So why hasn't LPG really taken off in Nigeria as much as it should?
So again, we can never start to dimension a problem from where we are currently. The challenge with the LPG offtake, again, goes back several decades where we were subsidizing kerosene. We defended the kerosene subsidy with all our hearts, not recognizing that on the flip side of that, we're having environmental degradation. We have people losing their lives because they're cooking with dirty fuels and the rest. What that meant, therefore, was that the extent of infrastructure investment that should have gone into LPG distribution terminals, storage facilities, domestic in-country cylinder manufacturing, training the retailers, building that kind of capacity, safety culture on themselves and the off-takers, that focus was not there until more recently. Now, that said, can we now acknowledge that there has been some growth? In the last 10, 12 years, we have literally seen the LPG sector grow year on year. In fact, from about 2019, 2020, we saw growth as high as 22%. And that has been kind of sustained over that time. So we're doing well compared to where we used to be. The challenge, again, is about the size of the population. All right. Now, within the National Gas Expansion Policy, as you know, one of the pillars of that is to have LPG now positioned as the preferred fuel for domestic, for small industries and the rest. But you can't now, you don't just pull that out of the air. Infrastructure is still a problem. The poor people who really need to let go of their kerosenes and the rest, need to be able to afford the cylinders. So we have people like Techno. My sister Ngozi, I totally respect her decision to go and start to manufacture cylinders in country.
Composite cylinders.
Yes, NCDMB, like you've pointed out, has made investments in, I think, about 2 or 3. There's Ron Gas and a couple of other domestic cylinder manufacturing plants. Now, that's going to change the narrative slowly, but they're still competing with substandard imports. Expired cylinders are still coming in because even the users, we need to educate them. People don't understand that you can't put a potential time bomb in your house because it's cheaper. So there are many things that need to be happening at the same time. We want to see how we incentivize more investments in the supply side, in the transmission and distribution side, creating franchise type structures, which is one of the things our company is working on, and then looking at how we tweak the mindset of users, even as simple as removing that whole concept of jollof rice is sweeter. I mean, we laugh about it, but these are some of the things that are, creating this.
You've touched on so many issues in the downstream sector. I want to look just at finance again. Europe is talking about pulling out of gas funding. But of course, Russia, Ukraine has forced them to readjust their hardcore stance a bit. In terms of your bid to raise capital, Are you now seeing a return of interest from global sources of capital in the Nigerian and African domestic market? Or do you think you'll still be reliant going forward on domestic capital markets and banks to raise funding for gas projects?
That's an excellent question. You know, every time you start to think about what has happened, international diplomacy, geopolitics, and energy security, it's amazing how we've seen a kind of volte-face in many situations. But that's fine. I mean, like you said, out of the war now, we're seeing that Europe is looking for, I think, about 60 BCM of gas that they need to replace. They want to replace their pipeline. And guess what? Everybody's now looking inwards into Africa. Now, what that has meant is that it is clear to most of us that we can put the net zero emission projections on one side, and it's still imperative, still critical from a sustainability perspective, but that we also need to be thinking about how we balance the current emergency energy crisis that the world is facing, especially off the back of some of the terrible natural disasters and climate change occurrences we've seen recently. So yes, based on that, we are seeing a kind of a softening of the stance of financiers. It helps also that gas has been recognized as a transition fuel. All right. The challenge I have is that I feel that most of the capital that is now turning inwards back into the continent is focused more on, again, those export-oriented.
So the upstream exports, the LNG.
That's right. Yeah. And literally, the game changer for us as a continent, as a country, is going to be deepening domestic consumption. So we want to see that more capital is coming into our kinds of projects that are focused on building capacity here. So we have seen it's become easier to have some of those conversations, but not at the scale that significantly shifts the needle.
Yeah.
And that's what needs to change.
Indeed.
However, if I would just land there.
Sure.
This imperative to build domestic financing is critical. And we must, as a nation, be looking at how we can stimulate,
our capital markets locally.
That's right.
It's
going to
a
make
challenge
us more
we've been
resilient.
trying to solve for decades and decades. Hopefully we'll get there. But Audrey, I wanted to ask you one last very quick question because they've just told me we're running out of time. What are you most excited about the future of gas and its contribution to economic development in Nigeria and the broader continent?
Okay, my excitement actually stems from looking at our population. And the fact that, as you know, we have over 60-65% of us being young. I think it's almost 70%, quite frankly. And these are young men and women that need productive activities to channel all their energies into. I see gas as that lever, if we do all the right things and maintain the focus, that can create those pockets of enterprise, those heavy gas-based industries, ceramic plants, fertilizer plants, and so on and so forth, that absorb a huge number of youth. So I see potential for immense employment generation, higher standards of living, a more resilient economy where our internally generated revenues are more, the buffer between that and what's happening in the global space is enhanced.
Yes.
So that's what I see that gas can do for us. And of course, there's all the environmental benefits from the sustainability perspective that is really important to take note of.
Wow, thank you so much, Audrey Joe-Ezigbo. Your wealth and treasure trove of knowledge, and thanks for ending on a positive note. So great to have you here on our show.
Thank you.